Welcome, Teachers Talk Radio and the weekly review. It's me this week, Nathan Ginn, in the chair, and I'm joined by Ben Thomas and John Gibbs to talk about the news stories this week. And of course, as always, this show is brought to you by John Catt Educational. Now, we've got 3 stories for us this week, and the first one that we're going to go to is about the government's 600 million package for school sport as part of the Lioness Legacy. This was on the BBC News this week. 23 members of the Euro-winning 2022 squad wrote a letter to the government, and this is the response we've got. So our first questions really are, is there enough sport in school, and is it equitable? So we'll head to Ben first. What are your thoughts on this?
Morning, everyone. I think it's a joke, to be honest with you, because we had this with the Olympics, the Olympic legacy that burned out quicker than the Olympic flame itself, really. I'm all for sport and legacy. That's kind of how I started in teaching. I was the only male in the school, so I ended up with PE. Luckily, I loved it. Obviously, this was in the kind of the late 2000s, but the principle is fantastic. I'm all for the equitable nature of education and how that's moving, but to suggest that they're going to lump 600 million into it but not really suggest where that's going to go. They've done some kind of brief surveys and some kind of brief percentages on what schools are actually doing, but I just don't see this lasting, and unfortunately the government have got previous, as I said, with the Olympic legacy, so I appreciate the sentiment behind it. But that 600 million really needs to be filtered into to training PE teachers, specific PE teachers in school, both at primary and secondary, to really kind of revamping the idea that training needs to be better for those people before they go into school to actually get future athletes moving forward. So like most of these kind of schemes, it's a great headline, 600 million. Wow, what an amazing pot of money! But actually, where's that going to end up going? What's the kind of the filters for where that money ends up, and what's the overall aims of the project really? I think looking at I think 67% of all schools that aren't quite equitable in the way that they offer football to girls, if we're talking specifics, that's really quite appalling in the current age. It shouldn't have taken, without going off on a complete tangent, the women to win something major for this to be a focus study. The whole thing is interesting, but I think it's going to be short-lived, unfortunately. I hope I'm wrong, but I hope that they're really kind of clear on how that money is going to be spent and actually ring-fencing that, because, as I said, we saw the Olympic legacy die out very, very quickly. So I hope that this sticks around a little bit longer and they're a little bit clearer on how they're going to spend the money.
Now, before we hear from John, I'm just going to quickly read out from Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. He said about this: last year, the Lionesses' victory changed the game. Young girls know when they take to the pitch that football is for them, and thanks the Lionesses, they too could be a part of the next generation to bring it home for their country. It seems to be coming on the back of this, as Ben said. John, what are your thoughts about it?
Well, absolutely, you're right. The word legacy should always immediately raise your hackles of sort of dubious feeling that something very dodgy is going on. I suspect that. I first heard the word legacy in relation to the Olympics and so on, and I think when they use that, you sense immediately it's trying to justify something, trying to create a possibility that there'll be a great change for the future. When there's a possible criticism that a lot of money is being spent on something like the Olympics. You say, well, there'll be legacy afterwards. Well, as you rightly say, Ben, I can't. Where's the evidence there's no evidence, actually. There's no evidence of dramatic change in public health or inclusion in sport or sporting activity as a result of the Olympics. However, I'll force this out of my throat. The Rishi Sunak observation that the Lionesses' victory was something of a cultural shift in our attitudes to women in sport. Yeah, I think that's true. I think women's football changed, and attitudes to women in football, and possibly attitudes to, and I think actually, not possibly, definitely, girls' attitude to how they can participate in sport changed. To some degree. I think the history books, the cultural histories of the future will point to the women's football European exploits and say something significant happened in our cultural history in relation to women in sport and our attitude to women in sport and so on. That was good. As for 600 million, well, yeah, every time the government announces money, you think, well, has it been spent before? 600 million over 2 years. Mm. Yeah, will it change much? Is this more of operation look over here and don't look at what else is going on in our managing of the economy, the consequences of Brexit and so on? It looks a bit like that. However, I was surprised to notice that he said 60% of schools now offer girls football. What, 40% don't? Astonishing. What, there are 40% of schools out there that don't let girls play football. They say go off and do lacrosse or something. It's just that astonished me.
I think so. As someone from a primary background as well, I think I'd echo what Ben has said about training and confidence for staff, particularly at primary level, in being and leading sport activities, because I think it is probably underfunded and underutilized in teacher training. This idea, we focus on English, we focus on maths, but as has been raised by other people in the lead up to this show, there are only so many things we can focus on at any one time, and it's shifting things around. So hopefully more than just a few spare footballs from that money coming around. Hopefully we'll see what the legacy truly is, and we are going to head on to our next story now, which is about Ofsted grades. Welcome back. So this story from Tess is about the Labour plan to replace Ofsted grades. Not so much a plan at the moment, but the Shadow Education Secretary has revealed that the Labour government is going to consult on a change to replace Ofsted grades with more of a scorecard. Now, we'll come to John first on this one. Ofsted grades in themselves, what are your feelings on it?
Well, where to start? I mean, the pernicious and desperately corrosive effect of Ofsted over the years. I kind of hold back the way in which it has changed. It's responded to changes in education, and is symptomatic of and accelerated those changes of liberalizing schools so that they compete with each other, of changing attitudes to teachers and how they teach, of seeing a school culture move over my career. I'm retired now, but it's my career from one where the emphasis was wrong on student achievement, but a data-driven obsession with where we are and how we've achieved, and in relation to either exam results or Ofsted grades or how teachers view themselves. I think it has reframed the culture of teaching in this country in a desperately unpleasant way, and I'd be glad to see the back of it. Do parents need some way of judging schools? Well, I think how do parents judge schools? They judge schools generally by talking to each other and rarely ever look at Ofsted reports, I would say. I mean, I think the details of an Ofsted report don't affect the way parents view schools, but they do need a way of evaluating schools. They do need a way of understanding what kind of school they've got in their local area. Possibly, I think, I guess they do. And some sort of health report on the school. Common sense understanding of how schools are doing from an outside observer could be helpful, but not this system. It's long overdue to go.
And the idea of school choice, I think, is very important. But I was reading, if we are going to allow parents this choice when we're looking at schools and they need that informed opinion. I read this recently that in St Neots there are 2 secondary schools, both are run by the same academy chain. That academy chain has come under some fire recently. So whether there really is parental choice at the end of all of this is another question on top of that. But Ben, when you're thinking about what that could mean for you, does a scorecard sound any better than what we get now, which is a breakdown of our grade anyway, which seems a bit like a scorecard?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great premise, but Labour aren't in power. So it's one of those where it's like, we're going to do this and we're trying to get people on side and kind of point scoring in terms of the confidence levels of where people are going to vote in the next election, whenever that may be. I mean, I agree with John. I've had both positive and very negative experiences of Ofsted over the last 15 years in the primary sector. The system doesn't work because of the quote in the article, and I completely endorse this, was the high stakes for staff, low information for parents, and that's what it is. You have some schools who will be in the Ofsted window who will spend all year, maybe year and a half, maybe 2 years, building up to a 2-day inspection. So the regularity of when Ofsted occurs, the indiscrepancies of certainly in previous years where you've got a school that was outstanding 8 years ago hasn't been touched by Ofsted. It's the regularity of how these inspections are run, and I think John is absolutely right, as I guess most educators would say, is that the whole system needs an overhaul. So I think the fact that the Shadow Education Secretary is saying, well, okay, this is a start, great, that's a really good starting point, but they're not going to be able to change it if they don't talk to people who have to go through an Ofsted, who have had those negative experiences, who have lost careers as a result of Ofsted, who have left the profession as a result of Ofsted, or the threat of Ofsted, because it is a threat, really. And yeah, look, there needs to be a way of kind of taking the temperature of schools, but I'd like to think we know as experienced educators on this show right now, it's the same. You walk into a classroom, you can walk into a classroom at the start of a lesson and know exactly how the lesson's going to go based on 2 minutes. So the whole idea that it's going to be a scorecard, it seems a little bit like a gimmick in terms of what they're calling it, but I appreciate that they have understood that it needs a reform. And I'd like to think that if there is a government change in the near future, that they will look at the education sector as a whole and go, okay, what is the best way of actually judging and looking at how schools are performing? And I think the annual review of safeguarding is brilliant, because that should be part of the course, whether you're part of a LEA, whether you're part of a MAP, whatever. That's it becomes natural if it's every year and when that's going to be and how you're going to work around it and what the expectations are. So there are lots of positives in that news article. I just don't think it goes, or it would go far enough to addressing the actual culture around it. And I think they're going to have to do a lot of work with parents around what that information will look like when, as John said and you said, Nathan, they've got a choice of schools in the local area. Go and look at those schools rather than the Ofsted report. I think there are still too many people that go, okay, well, these schools are on the same road, I'm just going to look at the Ofsted report. You need to go in and see what that culture is like. So it's a good start, but it's no way exhaustive of what needs to happen with the school inspectoral system, really.
And I should say, at odds with current policy, Nick Gibb responded to Labour's plan by saying, go soft on education standards portrays our children. We need...
Right, Nick. Good. Excellent. Well done.
Yeah. So, that is the current stance on it. But some kind of reform then we're thinking is possible, with a change of government, maybe, certainly from a workload impact point of view. We're ready for our next story, which will be about mixing pupils from different backgrounds. Okay, and so this is from Sky News. Really interesting story for me. Really had to sort of unpick where they were going with this, what they were saying. The headlines says, schools may have to ensure pupils mix with children from different backgrounds. And it's about pilots that will be carried out in Blackburn, Bradford, Peterborough, Walsall, and the London Borough of Waltham Forest, looking at particularly schools with single ethnic or religious communities. And it's coming as part of calls from the Integrated Community Strategy for a look at British values in inverted commas. So we'll go to Ben first. I guess, are we talking here about that general comprehensive mixed education, which is something that I would be positive for? Where do you stand on this idea that we should be mixing with people from different backgrounds?
Well, to answer that simple question, it's absolutely vital. I think it's talking about having children that are well-rounded and having children that are experiences that are different to their own in terms of sharing, religious beliefs, backgrounds, all that sort of stuff. But I can't quite believe that we are still in a position where we've got many of those schools left, if any. Like, what are we all saying, that there's schools in the country that they're all white middle class, or they're all of a certain religious belief. So again, without sounding like a broken record on this just seems like another soundbite to come out and go, right, well, that sounds like a good idea and we'll do that. I can't believe that we're talking about many schools, if any, that are just single, this is this religious belief, this is this ethnic background. I think if you read into the article, and obviously people will if they look at the show, it just seemed a little bit like they're trying to force these situations to occur, and rather than having them organically, it's like, right, well, you've got to do this, and it becomes policy, and it kind of almost takes the joy out of mixing with different backgrounds. And it's tricky because I work in a very ethnically diverse school in a very ethnically diverse area. So the policy behind this seems quite alien to me in terms of actually having that forced mix. I think it will be interesting to see what comes out of it. The other thing is about British values, and I think the government needs to be really careful about what that means, in terms of the background of what's happened this week with the BBC and how people have shared their views and stuff. So it's almost like they're almost kind of contradicting themselves in terms of what they want and what they expect to happen. It's it's difficult. I think in principle, again, it's great, but I just can't see that there are many schools that are just singly of this particular group, of this particular religious belief. So it's going to be interesting to see what the research throws up with that, because it just seems on paper like another fairly I say ill thought out policy, but just the kind of, right, well, that's a box ticking exercise that we've done, rather than actually looking at the reasons why those schools might be in those positions in the first place.
Yeah, I should say in the article itself, it doesn't talk about how many schools this would affect, or what that would look like for a lot of schools, beyond talking about how 63% of people think the government should be promoting St. George's Day more. And it's this kind of thing that's coming through. Now, John, on that kind of wider issue, we're talking British values and the mixing and comprehensive education, as I describe it, community schools at primary, those kind of things that I think of as part of being part of the British system. Do you think that we need more of this kind of integration and support? Where do you think it's going?
Well, overall, absolutely. If you say to someone, well, I think that schools should be diverse communities, a great mixture of social class background, of gender and so on, it sounds plausibly good and probably is good. Well, actually, the research into it is very mixed. Where in the United States, for instance, they have minorities within majority-dominated schools, the minorities tend to do badly. Where middle-class students are, middle-class students tend to do well wherever they are. Mostly, though, what this is about isn't about that. Isn't about the general view of should schools be more diverse. I'm sure they should be. What it is, it's a sort of dog whistle kind of unpleasant idea of asserting British dominant values in what is perceived to be a threat. Those within us who don't behave like us. And in 2016, there was this thing called the Casey Report. The Casey Report says, oh, there's schools in Birmingham, and there are schools in parts of London, there are schools in parts of Luton and so on, where 95% or so of the students are from a Muslim background. And that's very worrying, because these kids have little understanding of the majority values of society. Actually, I interviewed a guest a few weeks back, called a guy from UCL called Professor Jan Germain, a Dutch fellow, Jan Germain. I hope I'm getting his name right. And he said that he'd done extensive research and found, curiously enough, children of immigrants and immigrant children have a profound understanding of belief in generally accepted British values: tolerance, fair play, democracy. In fact, they've embraced that more than the majority population. And that is almost always true of immigrant groups. They generally wish to adopt the majority view. It's throwing up a straw man. This is something we need to be afraid of that we don't need to be afraid of. And worst of all, there was Damien Hines said in that report, he says, we need to make sure that fairness, tolerance, and respect are being understood in these schools. I mean, if I went into anyone's house, or I said to you, well, I think you could do with understanding fairness, tolerance, and respect. What an insult! Astonishing insult, as if those values aren't completely understood by any group in our society. And I'll say one more thing about this, is that there's absolutely this idea that we need to have diverse education is fine, except if you want to get your kid into the school where you don't want them sitting next to the oiks, which is a very strong part of parental choice in our country, is get my middle class child away from the working class kids. And if I can afford to do it, I'll put them into even more deeply culturally homogenous background of private schools. Personally, I'd have allocation of schools by lot, and that was tried in Brighton for a while. And although it's difficult in rural areas, I'd have allocation of schools by lot and allocation of university places by lot. If you really believe in diversity, do that.
Yeah, I should say in the article, they don't mention private schools at all when they're talking about diversity. They don't mention mixing of those students with people from other backgrounds. This does seem to be very targeted at a very specific or perceived specific problem by Sajid David. Right, we are on to the final section now of the show. So we will hear the jingle. We will. Hey, welcome back. The show today is, as always, brought to you by John Catt Educational, purveyors of wonderful books. My bookshelf, which you cannot see behind me on that side, is filled with some of their wonderful books. But today we are going to talk just a little bit about some of our shows from the past week and talk about some of our favourites. Now, to start us off, I think I'll come to Ben first, just to ask you which shows from Teachers Talk Radio stood out to you this week.
So I liked them all, obviously, but the one that stood out for me was Dr. Poppy Gibson. I have to call her Dr. or she gets very flustered by that. So hers was on behaviourism, which again is kind of a real passion of mine, just kind of behaviour in general, really. And she was interviewing Robert from a university lecturer, and they had quite a long discussion about what behaviourism is, different types of it. But the thing that really stuck out to me, and it was a bit of a throwaway comment from Poppy, but it was about how she as an adult, kind of, if she's doing something that's difficult, I think she mentioned, or her comment was about getting a deadline done for a university project. If I get this done, then I'll get a takeaway or treat myself to something else. This idea of like behaviours or recognition being a thing that you get as a result of something, and whether or not that is in schools at any level, whether that's teacher-led or whether that's kind of a society and culture within school. And it was really interesting because obviously we listen to these and we, the whole point of TTR is to get different views and to kind of reflect on our own practice, I think, particularly those people that are still involved, day-to-day education or work in education sectors. But it really did kind of, and it's a fairly recent show, so I haven't had time to fully digest it, but actually, what's the culture like of the school I work in terms of behaviour? Like, do we have classes that go, right, well, you get a stamp card and you then get a pencil sharpener or whatever? Or is it just the kind of actually doing the right thing and kind of working within an ecosystem to make it better for everyone as a student? So it was really, really interesting. I don't want to give away too much because I want people to go and listen to it. But this idea of kind of behaviourism and how that works and kind of what the driving factors of kind of being good in inverted commas and kind of towing the line is intrinsically linked to. I talked to my mum a couple of weeks ago on my pod about her experiences, and she talked about, kind of when she left, about this kind of visual thing that came in and, like the kind of the smiley and sad faces thing. And you think about that now and you think, God, how did education ever get to that point where that was deemed to be like the widely accepted view? And traffic light systems and all that sort of stuff. So it was really, really interesting. And I highly recommend sort of going and listen to it because it did make me really think about, our own practice in school and just how children react to things in general, really. So yeah, really, really good stuff.
And if you want to find that one, that is Dr. Poppy Gibson, Friday morning break from this week just gone. John, any standout shows for you this week?
Yeah, well, the one I'd recommend would be Hannah Wilson's Twilight Show last Monday. And that was a sponsored show by John Catt, and they were talking about a book by a chap called Bruce Robertson. And I liked the show for a number of reasons. One was a completely banal reason. Bruce Robertson has one of those kind of accents, Scottish accents that made you think, well, I just implicitly trust this guy. You know, he can sell me insurance, anything. I trust this. He's clearly a great head teacher based just on his soft, sort of reassuring Scottish accent. I wouldn't like to be told off by him at all. He'd be disappointed in me and I'd be very upset. But it was a book he'd written and it'd been illustrated by a woman called Fiona Wilson with very neat, very clever 50 or 60 illustrations through the book. And the book is called Power Up Your Pedagogy. And it basically is practical steps for schools to create the kind of culture and the kind of environment where you can improve what you do and think about what you do, but not in a highly technical way, but in a way that you can take something away from each section. I think the section of the book divides into sort of school culture, enhancing learning in class, and all practical sorts of things like that you can take from it. And I think of all, given that teachers are busy, this would be an ideal sort of book for them to have. It struck me. The other thing I liked about it was that Hannah herself is a practicing teacher and had used the book and read the book. So it was a real nice conversation between someone who'd written the book and someone who was using it practically.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, and I agree. The Bruce's voice just in somehow, I think I could listen to him for ages, and he has been a guest on previous episodes. So if you're looking on our ttradio.org/listenback search feature and you type in his name, you'll find a few episodes sort of going back over the years where he's spoken to us a number of times. My show for this week was technically just in this week. It was last Sunday, but in the evening. So I'm counting it as last week. And it was Shaniqua's show on Gypsy, Roma and Traveller communities. And I think, you know, it is a minority, but it is something that every school should be aware of because of, you know, there are myths, there are perceptions, there are all of these things that can really affect a community. And I think, you know, it's something that people really need to understand. And a really, really great interview there, really insightful, and just kind of sharing those ideas, broadening my kind of perspective on it, and just getting me to think a little bit wider. And so, yeah, that was Shaniqua's show last Sunday on Gypsy, Roma and Traveller communities. Now, that sets us up for the week that was. Next time, when we come back, we will have a whole new set of news stories for you. Remember, you can join us here live. You can message us as we go as well if you have comments and questions. But as always, you will find us on Twitter at TT Radio Official. So from us here, enjoy what's left of your weekend. Thank you, Ben.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
And thank you, John, as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
And we will see you all next time on the weekly review here at Teachers Talk Radio.